Okay, this is lesson 9 in booklet 1, and this is going to be looking at the lack of law and order in the early towns in the West, so the 1840s and 1850s. The main thing that we want to explore here is the difficulty that the authorities, and we say the authorities, we mean the US government, the law enforcement. We don't really call them the police. There we'll look at the idea of judges and marshals and sheriffs. And they're basically why it was so difficult for them to maintain law and order. So why was there a lack of law and order in these early, what we call mining towns? So we just need to cast our minds back a little bit to when we looked at the main reasons why people started to go west. So there was that lesson looking at the push and pull factors. And you'll remember that in 1848, there is a huge event that takes place in the West, which is the gold rush. So in California, on the west coast, Pacific coast of America, gold is found, and what happens is hundreds of thousands of people start to go to California to get to make their fortune, to become rich. In 1846, and the stat is here, the population of California was 8,000 people. 10 years later, that population had increased to 300,000. That is an incredible increase in population, unprecedented. And the reason for that is that people were excited by this idea of gold, and people from not only the United States but all over the world, so Germany, Scandinavia, Ireland, China in particular, migrated to California in order to make their fortune. So you can see how this was going to be a massive problem on law and order. There was already a lack of law enforcement anyway, and then all of a sudden, in the space of 10 years, you've got hundreds and thousands of people moving to one area. So it's going to be very, very hard to police that. So keep that in mind. That's a key stat there: 8,000 to 300,000. Really good for a revision card. But what we're going to do here is to start off with this image here. So you can only see just a little bit, and obviously the whole point is to kind of get an idea of what is happening in the picture. So you can see there's beams here. So what you should have really identified as a lady here in a group of men is that this actually is a hanging, or a lynching as it's referred to. And a lynching is when someone is hanged without trial. What this is a very sad story. Is in 1851 in California, this lady here was called Josefa. And Josefa was a Mexican lady who was living in California. It used to be part of Mexico. And she is collected by a group of people called vigilantes. The vigilantes are a group of people who take the law into their own hands. They do this usually because there is a lack of a police force or law enforcement. Josefa had killed a drunken gold miner who had attempted to molest her and then would have maybe then led to rape, and she kills him unintentionally. She's collected by this mob and she's hanged and she's killed. And there's many examples of this that happened in the West, of vigilante groups taking law into their own hands because of that lack of law enforcement. So what we've got here is we've got some other. So there's the full image there you can see of Josefa being hanged and being lynched. So what we can see is we've got a couple of other examples of what we call lawlessness that existed in these early mining towns. So what we'll do is we'll go through to the next page. We'll identify what this example of lawlessness is, and then briefly describe what it is. So I've done the first one for you. So obviously we just talked about that. So number one is the vigilantes. So as I said, due to a lack of law enforcement, many people took the law into their own hands, and these were called vigilantes. And this is the example of Josefa, who was lynched by the mob of vigilantes after she killed that drunken miner, attempts to molest her. So what I'd do now is I'd pause the video on this section here, and I'd copy that down so you can then write that up if you haven't done so already. Okay, so here are a number of other elements. Some of the information is actually on the next page. My document hasn't loaded that up, but I know that yours has that from the textbook, and it has a bit of information, but I can talk you through it myself anyway. So here, what we've got is we have the issue and problem of road agents. So you might call these people highwaymen. So basically, what they do is they would prey upon settlers and migrants who are, lacking protection. There's no kind of like police force that goes around, and also obviously the size of the United States as well. The size of a place like California, it's really hard to police it and enforce the law anyway. So road agents would prey upon settlers and migrants who had quite a lot of money and quite a lot of wealth, and rob them at gunpoint, essentially. So that's where you want to get that information in, just in your own words. I won't model everyone. So road agents, they're essentially highwaymen who rob people on the road who are vulnerable. And again, they once they've robbed that person, they could easily get away on horseback, and the law would never really be able to find them because of the vastness of the United States. This one here is often lots of people's favourite. This is something called rowdyism. Now, to be rowdy is to be excited about something, a bit boisterous, and it usually coincides with having an alcoholic beverage. What we've got here as well is a kind of an interesting woman who you would have found this kind of person in the saloons that were built in these mining towns. Again, any people who have played Red Dead Redemption will be familiar with this kind of idea. So ultimately, what a lot of miners did is they would go to the saloons, they would get drunk, to drink things like whiskey, beer. They would play cards, they would do a lot of gambling, play poker, and they would often seek out prostitutes. So rowdyism is, again, it's not robbery, but it is kind of showing that there's a lack of morals, there's a lack of law and order, really. And obviously, when people get drunk and people are armed, like road agents, violence would often happen, and there'd be disagreements over card games as well, and people could end up getting murdered and shot, which was very commonplace. And again, there is a lack of law enforcement to stop this from happening. Got to behave yourself in the pub. Right, obviously, number 4, you can probably imagine, is something to do with gold. So when these thousands of migrants make their way in 1848 and 49 to California to mine the gold and make their fortune, by the time many of them get there in the kind of 1850s, many of the plots, the main kind of areas of gold, had been taken up. But that didn't stop some people just taking it for themselves. And the process here is called claim jumping. What would happen is, imagine you've gone to California in 1849, you've gone with your family, you found gold, you've started to mine it, and then all of a sudden a gang of men with guns come and they basically say to you, this land is ours. And they would claim that land and basically jump into that land, is kind of like where the phrase comes from. And again, as you're that family, you can't really protect your own family, and there's no real law and order to protect you either. So claim jumping was quite common and quite frequent in California post the gold rush. So again, you just want to, using my words and using your own words, you want to explain that element of law and order. Okay. Right. So social unrest. So again, linked to what I just said, with hundreds of thousands of people migrating to California in order to become rich off the gold rush, and many of them got there, and many of the gold had gone or been taken by big companies already. There was a lot of unrest from people all over the world who had travelled, and we already mentioned, from Scandinavia, from Germany in particular, and China. So there's a lot of social unrest because a lot of people became unemployed, Because there were so many different cultures, different languages, and different people, tension kind of increased a lot more frequently in California. You don't have a job, you start to blame someone else, you start to scapegoat other people in society that you aren't used to. So if you're an American and all of a sudden you see German people or people from Sweden or people from China, you start to blame them. They're the reason why you've gone to California and you haven't made it, you haven't got the job. And again, it would bubble up into a melting pot really, and California became a bit of a melting pot. Again, difficult for the law and order authorities to deal with. Lastly, we've already mentioned Chinese migrants, and the main issue here is the racism that existed here. So Chinese migrants. This one here is obviously the social unrests, just like it says in the picture. Chinese migrants. So by 1852, there was approximately 20,000 Chinese migrants had come over looking for work. Many of them will end up working on the railroads as well. And a lot of racism towards these Chinese migrants. Again, people around the United States have not really come across people from China before. You know, different people, different race, different skin color, different language, alien to them really. So the tensions did kind of bubble a lot more, and there was a few examples of lots of Chinese migrants being murdered and being killed through disagreements from miners and settlers as well. Okay, so that's the first task. So you just need to make sure that you've identified the main aspects of lawlessness and given it a brief description, like my example here for the vigilantes as well. If you are not sure about any of these, obviously just replay the video or just email me and I will kind of explain via written word what you need to do or what that particular aspect is. Right, so that's the issues of lawlessness. So if you look back at the learning objective, you know, they're the reasons. They're some of the reasons. They're some of the examples of lawlessness. So we're going to look is then, what did the authorities do? Or what was the state of law enforcement? We've already said there's a lack of it, but what did it actually look like? So you go on to the next aspect here. So the main thing here is you're going to kind of identify what the different levels of law enforcement were, and you start at the very, very top at the federal government. And when we say the federal government, we're talking Washington DC, we're talking the very top, we're talking the president. Okay, so that's the first bit. So you've got a national is another word for it, national or federal. And then what we'll look at is there's also more local law and order. Yeah, just think about how our government runs. We've got a national government, you know, Prime Minister from 10 Downing Street, and then you in Barking and Dagenham have got a local borough, haven't you? Yeah, and then we've got the local community as well and what they did as well. So as it says here, just because obviously it was described as lawless, you know, the Wild West, that kind of thing, it did not mean that there was not laws or law enforcers. The only difficulty is that they had difficulty enforcing it. So what you need to do is you just read the information and you kind of bullet point the key facts. Yeah, I can't do it on this document at the moment. I might be able to do it. Right, okay, so you just read the information. So judges were appointed by the president to cases brought to them made by US Marshals, and there was 3 to supervise each state or territory. Think about the state of Texas. Texas is huge, California is huge. There was only 3 judges per state. There's only so many cases that they can listen to, so there's just simply not enough, really. So what you'd need to do, though, is just you kind of write down the key facts. You're not really concerning yourself about the problems at the moment, so you just write down 3 judges per state / territory, appointed by the president. Something like that. Look at the next one, the US Marshal, already mentioned, appointed by the president to oversee a territory or state. So one US Marshal is responsible for maintaining law and order in an entire state, capturing outlaws. They could appoint deputies in order to help them cover the vast areas under their responsibility. But again, the land is just too big for one person to kind of be in charge of all of law and order. So again, on this bit here, just kind of explain the key facts, just bullet point the key facts. Then you go into the local community, local authority, so it's a bit smaller. You had, mining communities had their own kind of judges and their own courts as well. They had a code trying to kind of encourage law and order. A sheriff, think about Woody from Toy Story, he is a sheriff. And a sheriff would kind of be in charge of one smaller area. If an area had a population of 5,000, they could elect their sheriff. 2-year period. They had very little training, so that again you can kind of see the issues of law and order. They can make arrests and put prisoners into jail as well. And then we obviously know about the vigilantes already, so just kind of remind yourself about the key facts about the vigilantes. Okay, so this is kind of introducing you to the first question on the American West paper. So you've already looked at the narrative account, which is question 2. This is question 1. It is the entry-level question, which is the consequence question. So it's worth 8 marks, but you answered 2 consequences. So each one is worth 4 marks. And the way that we kind of explain how to do it is called the double explanation. If you do GCSE geography, they often use the phrase, the double so what. So you give a piece of knowledge and you say, well, so what? Why is that important? And then you explain why it's important. Okay, so what? Then you go on to explain why that's important. So what you need to do is basically finish these up. So these are the problems for law and order, the reasons why there was such an issue. And you want to use specific factual evidence. So the geography of the USA was a big problem for law and order. Territories were huge areas with scattered settlements. Before the late 1860s, horseback was the fastest method of transport. So, as a result of that, so just think to yourself, you commit a crime, someone finally reports the crime, by the time it's been reported to the sheriff or the US Marshal, that criminal is long gone. So as a result of this, law and order was hard to enforce because criminals couldn't be caught. Consequently, lawlessness increased. People like road agents were able to get away with their crimes, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you just go through the rest of these, just complete the explanation. It's good practice, this, and you can see the kind of the key words that are being used. As a result, this meant that. Consequently, therefore, yeah, you want to get used to using these all the time, as we do. If you're struggling, here are some prompts to help you. So we've got a bit of exam practice here then. So this is what it looks like in the exam. So explain 2 consequences of mass migration in the early mining towns. Think about what mass migration is. Migration is the process of moving to one place from another. Mass is a lot. So consequence is what happens as a result of something. So as a result of many people moving to these early mining towns, what happened? What was the main consequence? So consequence 1. So I've done this one for you already. So have a little read through and we'll identify the key factual knowledge and where I'm explaining. I'm using that analytical language that I've already talked about. So one consequence of mass migration in the early Mayan towns was an increase in lawlessness. So there I've got my point. The fact that so many people are moving west has meant that there has been an increase in crime or lawlessness. For example, during the California Gold Rush, that's good knowledge, thousands of migrants headed west, but many plots of land where gold was found were stolen, and this was called claim jumping. Also, road agents would rob migrants making their way west as there was a lack of protection from the law. This meant that, so again, there's the analytical phrase. This meant that crime was increasing in the Mayan towns and the US authorities were struggling to conduct law and order due to there only being one US Marshal per state. Knowledge. As a result, analysis, many people took the law into their own hands, such as vigilante groups, meaning an increase in lawlessness in the West. Yeah, so it's got good knowledge, it's explained, it's got the double so what as well. It's explained two consequences, or a consequence of the lawlessness. More crime because of a lack of law and order. Doesn't necessarily need to be about crime though. So mass migration in the early mining towns. Well, think about the stat. If you want to do the second one on your own, think about the stat that we looked at the start of the lesson. You know, the fact that the population had increased in California from 8,000 to 300,000. You could talk about the Chinese migration as well, and the problems that led to, or other elements of lawlessness, rowdyism, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's it. The lesson summary is a bit further up. So again, just make sure you have the lesson summary. Identify that lawlessness increased due to mass migration in California. Identify that the US authorities did have things in place, such as the 3 judges or the US Marshal and the Sheriff, but because of the size and the vast size of the United States, they really struggled to enforce law and order. Okay, thank you. Hope that was helpful.